There is a story I have been telling myself for 12 years. Not a grand story. Not a dramatic one. A quiet, persistent story about who I was and what I was capable of and what had happened in the most significant failure of my adult life and why it had happened and whose fault it was. The story said, "It was yours." It said, "You were not enough. You could not hold it together. You made choices that damaged things irreparably and drove away someone who deserved better." And everything that followed, the years of rebuilding, the relationships that did not quite find their footing, the particular quality of self-doubt that colored every major decision, everything that followed was the logical consequence of being the kind of person who fails in that particular way. I believed that story completely. For 12 years. And then I learned the truth. Not a new truth, the truth that had always been true, that had been true for all 12 years while I was telling myself the wrong story. The truth that was simply waiting for the moment when the person who held it decided to share it. My name is Sandra. I am 43 years old. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the winters are long and the people are, in compensation, genuinely warm. For 12 years I carried a story about myself that was not accurate. And the day I learned that it was not accurate was one of the most disorienting and ultimately the most liberating days of my life. This is that story. I was married for 4 years in my late 20s. His name was David. We had met at 30 through a mutual friend and had moved into a relationship with the particular speed of people in their 30s who have some clarity about what they want and less patience for the slow, tentative approach of their 20s. We were engaged within a year. Married the year after that. The marriage was real. I want to say that because I think it matters. It was not a mistake from the beginning. Not something I entered with insufficient clarity or misplaced hope. I loved David genuinely and I believe he loved me genuinely, and the first 2 years of the marriage were, in many ways, the happiest of my adult life. And then, gradually and then completely, things fell apart. Not through a single event. Not through betrayal or dramatic rupture. Through the particular accumulation of incompatibilities that reveal themselves over time in ways that the initial love does not provide tools to manage. We were different in ways that the first year had presented as complementary and that the third year presented as irreconcilable. We did not have the communication skills, at that point in our respective developments, to bridge the differences that were real. The divorce, when it came, was quiet. Not friendly. There was real grief on both sides, and grief is rarely entirely civil. But not catastrophic. We separated our lives with the careful, muted pain of two people who had genuinely loved each other and who were genuinely sorry that love had not been sufficient. I moved to Minneapolis. He stayed in Chicago. We had no children, which simplified the practical geography if not the emotional one. And I began the years of making sense of what had happened. In the accounting I performed, the long, internal, repetitive accounting that follows a significant failure, I arrived at a conclusion about what had gone wrong and why. The conclusion was that it was primarily my fault. Not entirely. I was not so harsh on myself that I held myself solely responsible for a relationship that involved two people. But primarily, I had been, I concluded, too demanding, too intense, too unwilling to let certain things go. I had made choices during the difficult third year that had accelerated the collapse rather than slowed it. I had been, in certain moments, the less generous version of myself. This conclusion shaped how I understood myself for the next 12 years. It shaped what I believed I was capable of. It shaped the quality of hope I brought to subsequent relationships. It shaped, in the quiet and invisible way that foundational beliefs shape everything built on top of them, the entire edifice of my subsequent life. And it was wrong. Partly wrong, at least. Wrong enough to matter. Wrong in the specific way that the most damaging wrong beliefs are wrong, not entirely false, but with the crucial falseness concentrated at the foundation, where it does the most structural damage. I want to describe what 12 years of carrying a wrong story feels like. Not dramatically, it was not a dramatic burden, not something that prevented me from functioning or building a life. I functioned. I built a life. I have a career I'm proud of and friendships I value and a city I have come to genuinely love. The carrying was subtle. Interior. The kind of thing that shapes things without announcing itself. It showed up in the way I entered new relationships, with a particular watchfulness, a readiness to find and correct the things in myself that had been, in my accounting, the source of the previous failure. This watchfulness was not always useful. Sometimes what a relationship needs is not surveillance but presence, and the energy I spent monitoring myself for signs of the patterns I feared I would repeat left less energy available for the being there that actual closeness requires. It showed up in the ambitions I declined to pursue. The job that would have required more of me, more vulnerability, more visibility, more of the particular intensity that I had concluded was my problem, I said no to because I had decided that my version of more was too much. That the version of myself who brought full force to things was the version who had damaged her marriage. It showed up in therapy. I went to therapy 3 times in those 12 years. Each time, the conversation circled around the same terrain. The divorce, my role in it, my patterns, my responsibility. Each therapist, good therapists, all of them, worked with the information I provided. And the information I provided was shaped by the conclusion I had reached and was not, in retrospect, the full picture. You cannot get to the right answer if you are working from the wrong question. I was working from, why am I the kind of person who fails at love? The right question was the story I told about what happened actually true? I did not know to ask the right question for 12 years. And then, on an ordinary afternoon in March, David's sister called me. Her name is Ellen. We had been friendly during the marriage, not close, but warm in the way of people who genuinely like each other and whose relationship is bounded by a shared connection that they do not entirely direct. After the divorce, we had drifted in the way that in-law relationships drift when the marriage that connected them ends. We had not spoken in 7 years. She called because David had died. A sudden thing, a cardiac event, unforeseen, at 48. He was gone before the hospital. I received the news with the particular complicated grief of someone who had loved a person, had lost them in a different way years before, and was now losing them entirely. I cried in a way that surprised me with its completeness. For the man he had been and the marriage we had had and the particular sadness of a life that ended too soon. And then Ellen said, I've wanted to call you for years. There are some things I think you should know. I want to be careful here. David is gone. He cannot speak for himself. And I am aware, I have been aware since the conversation with Ellen, aware with a particular care that his death has made more urgent, that whatever I share about him must be handled with the respect owed to someone who is no longer here to offer his own account. So I will share what Ellen told me in the spirit in which she shared it. Not to diminish him, not to reassign all responsibility from me to him, but to give me, and through this story, perhaps others, a truer picture than the one I had been living inside. Ellen told me that David had known, during the difficult 3rd year of our marriage, that he was struggling with something he had not shared with me. A depression, not my word for it but the word his family used, the word that had attached itself to his behavior in that period after the fact, when they were all looking back and trying to understand what had happened to their brother in the years before the divorce. He had not been well. In a way that he had not told me about, had not sought help for, had instead managed by withdrawing, from me, from the intimacy of the marriage, from the vulnerability that closeness requires. The withdrawal had looked, from inside it, like my failure. Like evidence that I was too much, too demanding, too intense. It was not. It was a man who was not able to be present in the way I needed him to be present, and who did not have the tools to explain why, and who, Ellen said this carefully, had, in the years after the divorce, understood this about himself and carried a regret about it that he had never found the opportunity or the courage to share with me directly. She said, he talked about you. More than you might think. He never blamed you for leaving. He knew why you left. He thought it was the right thing to do, given what he had not been able to give you. But he also knew he had never told you his side of why things went wrong. And I think he was going to. I think he kept meaning to. And then he didn't have the chance. Pause, 6 seconds. I sat with that for a long time. Not with the information itself, though the information required its own sitting with, the particular recalibration of understanding something significant about the past. But with the larger thing the information pointed toward. For 12 years I had been the failure. And the truth, the actual, full truth, was that 2 people had failed a marriage for 2 different sets of reasons, neither of which was the whole story, and neither of which made either of them a person incapable of love or connection or the things they had been reaching for. I had not been too much. I had been alone with something I did not understand, in a marriage where the other person was also alone with something he could not share. We had both been, in our different ways, doing the best we could with tools that were not adequate for what the situation required. That was the truth. Not the whole truth. Nothing is ever the whole truth. But a fuller truth than the one I had been carrying. And even that fuller truth, partial, imperfect, arriving 12 years late from the sister of a man who could no longer speak for himself, changed something. I went back to therapy. Not because I was in crisis. The grief of David's death was real and required attention, but I was not in crisis. I went back because I understood, for the first time with any clarity, that the work I had been doing in the previous 3 rounds of therapy had been built on a foundation that was not entirely accurate. And I wanted to rebuild on a truer foundation. My therapist this time was a man named Dr. Perez, who had a quality of patient precision that I found initially challenging and eventually essential. He helped me do something I had not done in 12 years of privately processing the marriage and its end. He helped me look at it without the conclusion already decided. This sounds simple. It was, for me, revolutionary. For 12 years, my understanding of what had happened had been structured by a conclusion I had reached in the immediate aftermath of the divorce, when I was grieving and confused and doing the human thing of locating the explanation that gave me the most control over the narrative, even if that control came at my own expense. If it was my fault, then it was something I could have done differently. And if it was something I could have done differently, then I was the agent rather than the subject. Which felt, in some perverse way, safer than the alternative, that sometimes things fall apart for reasons that are not entirely within anyone's control. Dr. Perez helped me see this pattern, helped me understand that the story of my fault had been, in part, a way of giving myself agency in a situation where the actual level of my agency was more complicated than the story allowed. And he helped me grieve. Not only the divorce, I had grieved that, imperfectly, at the time, but the 12 years of self-diminishment. The opportunities not pursued because I had concluded I was too much. The relationships entered with the particular wariness of someone carrying a story about her own capacity for damage. The version of myself that I had been living inside, capable and functioning and genuinely building something, but always with a ceiling, a self-imposed limit, a quiet internal voice that said, "This is enough for someone like you. Don't ask for more." Grieving that was harder than grieving the marriage. Because the marriage was something that had happened. The 12 years were something I had been doing to myself. And the distinction between those two things, between what was done to you and what you did in response, between the event and the story you built from it, is one of the most important distinctions there is. Because the event is finished. But the story can be changed. I am different now than I was before Ellen's call. Not because the call resolved everything. It did not. And I want to be honest about the complexity of receiving information that changes a significant part of your self-understanding. There is grief in that. For the 12 years themselves. For David, who died without knowing that I now understood more of what he had been going through. For the version of our marriage that might have been possible if we had both had the tools and the honesty at the time that we did not. But I am different. The ceiling is gone. I do not mean I have become a different person. I am, recognizably, the same woman who has lived in Minneapolis for 12 years and who makes the same coffee in the same morning ritual and who loves the same friends and finds meaning in the same work. But the internal quality of things has changed. I applied for a position that I would have declined before. A leadership role, the kind that required exactly the quality of intensity and presence that I had concluded was my problem. I applied. I prepared for it with the specific confidence of someone who has stopped explaining herself as a liability before anyone has a chance to assess her as an asset. I got the job. I entered a relationship. Not dramatically. A man named Peter, who I had known peripherally for 2 years and who had been interested for longer than I had allowed myself to receive. I let myself receive it. Not recklessly. I am 43 years old and I have learned things that I am not going to unlearn in the flush of a new connection. But without the particular watchfulness of someone monitoring herself for signs of the damage she might do. With the presence that actual closeness requires. With the full version of myself rather than the managed, self-limiting version. It is going well. That is not a small thing to be able to say. And I think about David. With the complicated love that you feel for people who were significant in your life and who are no longer here. With gratitude for what the marriage was, in its real years. With sadness for what it could not be. With a particular, carefully held compassion for a man who was struggling with something he could not share and who carried his own version of the story for a long time. He was not entirely the person I had constructed from the story of my fault. And I was not entirely the person the story said I was. We were two people doing our best in a situation that asked more than we had at the time. That is the truth. Finally, all of it. The karma in this story is in the 12 years. Not as punishment. I did not deserve 12 years of self-diminishment as cosmic payment for anything I had done. But as the consequence of a very human thing, the tendency to construct the most immediately available explanation for pain, rather than the most accurate one. I constructed the most immediately available explanation. And I lived inside it for 12 years. That is the karma, not someone else's wrongdoing punished, but my own misunderstanding costing me more than the actual events had to cost. The additional price we pay when we turn our pain into a story about our permanent inadequacy rather than a story about a specific difficult situation that has a specific end. And the correction, the karma's other operation, the one that is less discussed but equally real, came in the form of a phone call from a woman I had not spoken to in 7 years, who had been sitting with a truth she believed I deserved to know. Ellen did not have to call me. She called because she thought it was right. That is its own kind of grace. I think about her often. I have thanked her, more than once, for what the call gave me. She said, on one occasion, I should have called years ago. I knew things that belonged to you. I didn't know if it was my place. I told her, it was absolutely your place. It was always your place. And I am so glad you found it. I want to say something about the stories we tell ourselves. Not the stories we tell others, those are also worth examining. But that is a different conversation. The stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why things happened the way they did and what those happenings mean about what we are capable of. Those stories are powerful. More powerful than most of us realize. Because they operate below the level of the decisions we make, they shape the decision-making machinery itself. They determine what we consider possible before we have even arrived at the consideration. They set ceilings that feel like facts. And they are, some of them, many of them, wrong. Not entirely. The stories that are entirely wrong are relatively easy to question, because nothing confirms them. The ones that do the most damage are the ones that are partially right, that contain enough real elements to feel true, while the falseness lives at the foundation where it is hardest to reach. I carried a partially right story for 12 years. You may be carrying one too. I do not know what your story is, but I want to suggest something. Consider the possibility that the version of yourself you have been living inside, the one shaped by the explanation you constructed for the most significant difficult thing that happened to you, consider the possibility that it is not the whole truth. Consider the possibility that you were not too much, that you were not too little, that the failure was not evidence of a permanent incapacity, but of a specific situation that had specific causes that were not all yours and that do not define what you are capable of going forward. Consider it. Because the story can be changed. Not the event is finished. But the story built from it is yours to revise. And the revision does not require a phone call from someone who holds the other side of the truth. Sometimes it requires only the willingness to ask, is the story I have been telling myself the most accurate one available? Or is it simply the most available one? Ask that question. And be willing to find a different answer. This has been Soul Tales. My name is Sandra. The ceiling is gone. I did not know, for 12 years, that it had been there. I know now. And I am, finally, free. End.